So if we see it as a statement of needs and we're trying to figure out how to meet everybody's real needs, then we look for ways to solve that as a problem rather than it's a win-lose competition. And if I give you more, then he gets less sort of thing.
Welcome to Tilt Parenting, a podcast featuring interviews and conversations aimed at inspiring, informing, and supporting parents raising differently wired kids. I'm your host, Debbie Reber, and if you're the parent of more than one child, neurotypical or atypical, this is an episode you're definitely going to want to listen to. I get requests for topics from listeners all the time, which, by the way, is great. Please keep them coming. But one of the most common requests is for an episode specifically on sibling relationships. So I found the perfect guest to talk about the sibling dynamic, parent educator Julie King. Julie co-authored the book How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen, a survival guide for life with children ages 2 to 7, alongside Joanna Faber. And she leads dynamic lecture presentations for schools and other parent organizations. Among the workshops she offers is one based on Siblings Without Rivalry, and she brings to her work the perspective of having raised 2 differently wired and 1 neurotypical kids herself. I'm really excited to share this conversation with you, and I hope to do more episodes on this topic. So here is my conversation with Julie. Hey, Julie, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's nice to be here.
Well, I'm looking forward to this conversation. This topic we're going to go into today is something I've been getting requests for a long time from my community. And I think there's a lot to talk about, but I'm just looking forward to scratching the surface with you and getting a little deeper into this idea of siblings and how complicated those relationships can be. But before we get into that, I always ask my guests to just introduce themselves, give us a little bit about your personal background, maybe your family makeup. And also, I always like to know people's personal why for the work that they do.
Sure. Well, as you know, I wrote the book, How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen, with my friend Joanna Faber. She and I met as babies. My family had just moved to the suburbs of New York, as had her family. Her mother was pushing her and her brother up the street in the stroller, and my mother saw them outside, literally went running outside and invited them in. And her mother, Adele, and my mother, Pat, became very good friends. And Joanne and I became good friends. Well, at that point, we were just babies, but we went to nursery school together, actually all the way through high school together. But while we were in nursery school, her mother took a parenting workshop with a child psychologist, Haim Ginott, and she and my mother would talk daily about what she was learning, and they would experiment on Joanna and me and our siblings. So we were really guinea pigs for this whole approach. And after high school, we kind of went our separate ways. She went to college. I ended up going to law school, and I practiced law briefly and decided that the way that lawyers approach conflict was really not consistent with sort of my orientation to problem solving and considering people's needs. And so when I'm sort of condensing my life story here for you, I married, and my husband and I had 3 kids, and I discovered firsthand that it's kind of hard to do this all the time. Mm-hmm. This approach that I grew up with and I thought I knew was quite challenging. When my firstborn, Asher, was a baby, I helped form a mother's group. We used to get together every week. And I noticed that the other babies were starting to move around when he was just still sitting. But I read all those books about child development that said babies develop at different rates. So I really wasn't worried until when he was just over a year, our pediatrician said, okay, now it's time, you have to go see a neurologist. And the neurologist told me that Asher was, quote unquote, very developmentally delayed. By that time, I had noticed that it was pretty obvious that all the other kids his age were walking around, and, they would toddle around and fall on top of him sometimes, and he would shrink away and fear when they came near because he couldn't move. He could, this tiny little sit scoop, but he really couldn't move very much. And I remember being offended when one of the other mothers in the group suggested that I was being a little overprotective of him, as if it were my fault that he wasn't able to move. And I think underneath that, I was just worried that she might be right. And I think that's a common experience for people with, kids who are different. And for Asher, it wasn't just his physical development. His sensory system was also different too. So he couldn't tolerate being touched on his legs and his feet, which really didn't bode well for him being able to walk because he couldn't touch his feet to the ground. So he went to physical therapy, and the therapist gave me a brushing routine that I was supposed to do every 2 hours, which of course was impossible. So that added to my guilt, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I couldn't keep that up. But, we did that as much as we could. And then I had a second child, Rashi, another boy, who he looked different to me from the start. But at that point, Asher my firstborn was still in physical therapy. So I got them back-to-back appointments. But my second one was different from my first. My first one was floppy. The second one was stiff. Asher, my first, was very sensitive. Rashi didn't cry when he got shots in his thigh. He didn't seem to be as interactive with me in the world. He didn't seem to respond to sound in the usual way. So it was scary and worrisome in a different way. And then we had our third child, and I had a daughter. Her name is Shiriel. And at that point, I figured, well, if I have a child, I really need to take them to the child development specialist, because that's what you do in my family. Mm-hmm. And I was kind of shocked to find out that she was a typically developing child. So Asher, he had sensory processing disorder, which is actually not a diagnosis when he was little. And Rashi was eventually diagnosed with Asperger's, which, as you know, is now considered an autism spectrum disorder. And he was also diagnosed with very severe sleep apnea when he was 9, although I'm sure he had it all his life. And I want to mention that I have talked to my kids about talking to you about them and about their diagnoses, and they've given me permission to talk about them.
Okay.
Just so you know. So I started leading workshops, the How to Talk workshops, when my oldest Asher was in preschool. And those early groups were for all parents. And eventually I started leading workshops specifically for parents with kids on the autism spectrum and for parents of kids with sensory processing disorder. Because I noticed that the skills that I was teaching were just as important, or maybe even more important, because we parents of atypical kids face challenges that other people don't face. It's even more important for us to know how to deal with frustration and conflicts and setbacks. And you know what they say about kids with autism? If you've met one kid with autism, you've met one kid with autism.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So as a parent, it's very challenging to figure out how your child is experiencing the world and why they're doing what they're doing and what it's reasonable to expect of them. And what I noticed, especially when my kids were younger, is that most of the information and the programs that are set up for these kids, they address the behavioral issues of kids on the spectrum in a way that I think of as behavior modification, like giving them stickers and rewards and consequences and timeouts, that sort of thing. And to me, it seems like these methods don't acknowledge the full humanity of these kids. They're treating them as people to be managed or people to be controlled. And I'm trying to help people see their child as more than just a problem to be controlled and managed and manipulated. You know, clearly to some extent we all have to manage our children, and maybe we all have the ultimate goal that our kids will be well behaved so life will be pleasant for all of us. But the How to Talk approach encourages people to start by seeing the world through their children's eyes and to imagine what their children are experiencing. If we start with that, then I think it becomes easier to affect their behavior, because we're not fighting with them. We're not saying to ourselves, this kid won't sit still. I've got to figure out ways to make him sit still so he doesn't drop food all over the living room. We're saying, this kid doesn't want to sit still. He really needs to move. What can I do to satisfy him and satisfy my need not to have food all over the living room? Mm-hmm. Right? And then we look for possible solutions. So I'm not advocating that we be permissive. I'm suggesting that there are more creative ways to meet each other's needs. And we have many stories in the book of parents working with their kids and their kids' needs instead of trying to control them.
That's great. You know, we just had on the show recently, Dr. Barry Prezant. Have you read his book, Uniquely Human?
Oh, yes. It's terrific.
Yeah. So in alignment with everything that you're saying too, you know, that not looking at the behaviors. I mean, that's the philosophy of Tilt and, you know, the guests that I have on, but I just love hearing from so many people, and the work that you're doing and just kind of helping to spread the word that this is a reframe that we as parents really have to make in how we're parenting and viewing our kids' behavior.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And let me just ask you, how old are your kids now?
Oh, yes. So now Asher is 26 He's a partner in an online marketing company, and Rashi's 23. He's a computer programmer, and my daughter Shiriel is 20. She's a sophomore at Stanford, majoring in American Studies. And I have to say that we've had our share of sibling conflicts when they were little, but now they all get along very well. They call each other just to check in, and they give each other advice and support, and they even like to come home for dinner and have dinner with me and my husband so often. So I'm at a totally new stage now than I suspect many of your listeners are at.
Yes, but it's actually really inspiring for us to hear from parents in the stage that you're at, because, it sounds like your kids are all, that they're thriving, and that's really inspiring for us to hear too. I'd say, most of the TILT community, we have kids in those elementary and middle school years, I think, is kind of the bulk of our audience. And it's really hard to see or even imagine what this could possibly look like down the road, because we're so in the thick of it right now and the hard stuff. So that's really cool.
Yeah. A friend of mine put me in touch with another mom of a child who had a similar sort of profile to my second son when he was much younger. And her child was older, and she was telling me that her son followed a very different developmental path than most of the kids his age. And, she went through many moments wondering, will they ever get to a point where he can be more independent? What will the future look like? And she was trying to paint a hopeful picture to me. And I remember thinking, well, she just really doesn't know, because nobody really knows. And so I know that worry. I know that, we can't help but wonder, what will the future bring? And I think when I was in the thick of it, I mostly focused on how we were going to get through tomorrow or this afternoon. And my husband was more, he took the role of worrying about the greater future. But, it's hard not to think about that when you're raising your kids, especially when they have differences.
Yeah, absolutely. Especially when you have a really crappy day. I mean, it's, you can be humming along and then suddenly things go downhill quickly and you're questioning everything and spiraling out of control about concerns about the future. So, well, I appreciate your perspective and you sharing that. That's really helpful to hear, not just for the listeners, but for me personally. We'll be right back after this quick break. Maybe I've watched too many seasons of The Amazing Race, but every time I have to go somewhere on the subway, I treat it like a competition. It's all about making the right gut decisions about which route will get me there the fastest. Sometimes those decisions get me where I'm going early, and other times my gambles don't really pay off. Probiotics can't help with most gut decisions, but if your gut needs a little support, Ritual has your back. Their Synbiotic Plus, a 3-in-1 supplement, has clinically studied prebiotics, probiotics, and a postbiotic to support a balanced gut microbiome. I've been using Synbiotic Plus for about 6 months now, and it's become a core part of my morning routine. I take the mini capsule every morning while making my way through my inbox, whether I'm at home or I'm on the road, because it doesn't need to be refrigerated. And the capsule itself is delayed released, which helps it survive the harsh conditions of the upper GI tract for delivery to the colon, and that's exactly where we want it to go. Ritual invested in a study modeling the human colon, which showed that Synbiotic Plus significantly increased microbial diversity and the growth of beneficial bacteria. There's no more shame in your gut game. Synbiotic Plus and Ritual are here to celebrate, not hide your insides. Get 25% off your first month for a limited time at ritual.com/tilt. Start Ritual or add Synbiotic Plus to your subscription today. That's ritual.com/tilt for 25% off. During this month of planning and organization for big transitions, rhythms and routines have been absolutely essential for our physical and emotional well-being. So Green Chef nights are reliably and predictably a good night. We know the ingredients will be fresh and prepped, the instructions easy to follow, and the meal delicious. We're all still talking about last week's turkey tacos with mango chimichurri sauce, refried beans, and Monterey Jack cheese. Green Chef contributes to a healthy lifestyle with easy and delicious menus like fresh seasonal salads and grain bowls, and with over 80 weekly meal and market options, plus rotating options to suit a variety of lifestyles, whether Mediterranean, plant-based, calorie-smart, keto, protein-packed, gluten-free. There are always plenty of options to choose from. Whatever you select, you'll get farm-fresh ingredients, organic whole fruits and veggies, and premium proteins, all delivered straight to your door. I love those 4 words. Straight to my door. Oh, and one more thing I love about Green Chef, they have an app, which means it's easy to manage meal preferences and delivery from your phone if you want to. And I, for one, want to. I am in that mode where I'm making the most of little moments like waiting in line at the pharmacy or for the F train to pull into the station to tackle all of those to-dos. So the convenience of an app is key for me. Green Chef has a special offer for Tilt listeners. Go to greenchef.com/tilt50 and use code TILT50 to get 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months. That's 50% off plus 20% off your next 2 months when you use the code TILT50 at greenchef.com/tilt50. So I want to talk about siblings. And as you know, you and I were discussing before the conversation, and as most of my listeners know, I have one child, and actually his name is Asher as well. And great name. And so, you know, this is something that I don't have personal experience with. And, you know, I have asked guests who I brought on for various topics to touch upon sibling issues here or there, but I get a lot of questions from audience members who are just really finding it challenging to balance the needs of their differently wired kids, whether they're both differently wired, but in distinct, unique ways, or if they have one typical child and one neurotypical, you know, and it's complicated. And so as a way to get into that, I know that you have given and you give the Siblings Without Rivalry workshops. And I'm just kind of curious, maybe if we could talk generally about some of the common conflicts that come up with siblings, regardless of how they're wired. And then we can hone in on some of the unique circumstances with differently wired kids.
Well, I think that before we have kids, we have this idealized notion, at least some of us do, those of us who step off the cliff and have a couple more, that the kids will, you know, more or less enjoy being together, and they'll play together, and we'll have this wonderful, harmonious family. And I think once we have more than one child, what we find is that we don't actually live happily ever after. We live sort of conflictually ever after, because everybody has different needs. This one wants the window open, and that one wants the window shut. This one wants to sing, that one needs quiet. This one wants to sit in your lap, the other one wants to sit in your lap. So I think that conflict is actually sort of a part of life when you're living with a group of people, especially when you have people with such different needs. I think sometimes we have to change our expectation, not from, you know, what am I doing wrong because the kids are fighting, but how do I use this as an opportunity to teach them how to resolve conflict in a peaceable way? I think that's a much more realistic frame for what we're doing when we have kids. You know, of course, when one kid is, if your special needs kid is freaking out, we don't want everybody else to be freaking out too. We don't want the sibling to start screaming and demanding attention, and it would be easier on us. But I think that's unrealistic. I think it's unrealistic to expect that our neurotypical child will accommodate when the special needs kid is having a hard time. Everybody has needs, and if we view it from the lens of how do we figure out what everybody's needs are, and then how do we find a solution that works for everybody, then, I mean, that's really the sort of general frame that I use to look at sibling conflict and resolve sibling conflict.
Yeah. So, okay. So many things are coming up, and I want to ask you a ton of questions.
Sure.
But I also don't want to bombard you with all of these things. So I guess one of the things, and maybe I don't know if even this is the right order, but this came up as you were answering that, maybe when you work with families, are you working with the kids too? Are you bringing them into the process? And I guess I'm wondering, how much transparency do you have, especially in a situation where kids are neurotypical versus neurologically atypical? You know, is this something we just get all out in the open and talk about it in that way and enlist everyone's cooperation?
If you're asking me what I do with parents, I work only with the parents.
Okay.
I sort of coach them on how to talk to their kids. I role play with them so that they can practice with people pretending to be kids, but a little bit more, calm and reasonable,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
or play acting. So it's a little bit easier. But then I send them home to actually try these things out with their kids. But nothing that I am telling them is a secret from their kids. Sometimes people say to me, My kid picked up the book and started reading the cartoons. Is that okay? I'm like, absolutely. These are tools and strategies that are useful for everybody in all relationships. They're not secrets. And so when you say, is there transparency, kids often know that their parents are going through a parenting workshop. In fact, I've had parents come back to me and say, things were so much better this week. My kids, when I told them I was going to the parenting workshop again, they said, good, go.
Yeah.
We like that, please.
Mm-hmm. So I want to talk about the question I get the most from people with regards to the challenges that they're having in their home. And you mentioned guilt earlier. It's often this sense of guilt that their differently wired child is kind of taking up so much of the parent's time, that so much they feel like all of their efforts are going, and resources, sometimes it is their financial resources, everything is going towards this one child, and the other child is typical. And so they just aren't requiring as much. And maybe that's fine for them, but this sense of guilt is pretty pervasive. Is that something you have experience with and parents you've worked with, and can you speak to that issue?
Yes. Yes, it is challenging. I think we have this notion that I should be trying to be fair with my kids. It's not right that I'm devoting all these resources to one kid and another. And sometimes our kids will say to us, it's not fair. You're always taking him places. You don't take me places. Or, you're always spending time with him. And it's tempting to say, hey, honey, it's not all about you. Your brother has special needs. We really need to, blah, blah, blah. That's how they hear it. What kid is going to honestly respond, oh, I didn't realize, thanks for explaining it to me, right? Yeah. Very unlikely. So you don't want to make it sound like the typical kid's needs are less important than his siblings, because that's a sure formula for them to start hating and resenting their sibling. You're better off reframing it as a problem. My problem is I have to help your brother with his exercises, and I also want to help you plan your birthday party. Let's see how we can make that happen. When I'm at my best, I don't make it sound like there's a finite amount of love and that the typical kid is being selfish to demand attention, or that their needs aren't as important. I don't want them to feel like they should be grateful not to be disabled. That's, it's tempting to want to say these things to kids, but that's just not helpful. It's tempting to say to the typical kid, like, you're lucky. You have friends. You can do homework without me. You're independent. But really, you're not going to convince a kid that he's the lucky one by telling him he doesn't need your attention, right? So, my goal is not to give my 3 children equal attention. That would be impossible. Regardless of whether they have special needs or not, frankly. My goal is to give my children the attention they need. So if a child feels like they're not getting enough of your attention, you can avoid accusing them of being greedy. Like, what do you mean I never do anything for you? I just spent 3 hours at your soccer game. Like that kind of thing. That's how we think.
Yes.
But it's not a complaint that's grounded in logic. What they're telling you is, I miss you. I want more of you. So we can acknowledge that feeling. You wish we had more time together. I can't do it now. So let's make a plan. When can we do it? And then maybe you can spend time together when daddy's home, or your sister's napping, or your brother's with the therapist. So if we see it as a statement of needs, and we're trying to figure out how to meet everybody's real needs, then we look for ways to solve that as a problem, rather than it's a win-lose competition. And if I give you more, then he gets less, sort of thing.
It seems like it's a situation too where that empathy piece is really critical. Like the acknowledgement of the child's feelings is
that's absolutely critical. If you don't start there, no solution will work. Because you have to start by acknowledging that this is a real feeling, and you really do wish you had more time with me, and you don't like this. And if I try to gloss over that, I would say, oh, honey, I'll talk to you later. They feel like, no, Mommy, you don't get it. I want you now. And even if I can't do it now, if I can say, oh, I wish I could do it now. I see how urgent it feels to you. If I start there, then when I say, well, can we do? I can't do it now. We want our kids to see things from each other's perspectives, right? We want our typical child to see things from our perspective and understand from their kids' perspective. But if we don't start with their perspective, they're not going to look at things from our perspective. That's how they learn that skill.
We'll be right back after this quick break. Hey there, it's Debbie. I love making this show and sharing conversations about how to support our awesome neurodivergent kids. I've seen how even one little insight from an interview can spark a big shift in daily life. But I know that raising complex kids can be messy and lonely. And just when we think we figured it out, something comes up that boots us right back to feeling overwhelmed and stuck. That's why I've poured everything into creating a way for parents like us navigating complex parenting journeys to join together and chart a path that feels positive, hopeful, and doable. It's the brand new Differently Wired Club experience. In the club, you'll get personal support from me and other seasoned parent coaches, 6 live calls every month where you can connect and get your personal questions answered, the opportunity to learn directly from authors and experts like I have on this show, monthly themes for getting specific and tactical, an exclusive private podcast feed, and the best, most generous community of parents. Seriously, these folks show up for themselves and each other, and that right there is really everything. Because it's a daily reminder that we're not alone. Our kids aren't broken, and we have totally got this. The recently rebooted Differently Wired Club is on a brand new platform with its very own iOS and Android app. It is such a great space. However you learn, whatever your style, no matter the ages, genders, and neurodivergent profile of your children, the Differently Wired Club can help you cultivate the positive shifts you're hoping for. Join us today by going to tiltparenting.com/club. That's tiltparenting.com/club. I hope to see you on the inside.
Are you overwhelmed by the things that get in the way of you doing what you want to do? Are you looking for ways to simplify life to better align with your values? Do you want to create space in your schedule so you have room for more of the good stuff? Play, joy, relationships, gratitude, and more? If you answered yes to any of these questions, I invite you to check out Edit Your Life, a podcast to help you edit the unnecessary from your life so you have more room to enjoy the awesome. Through episodes with me, Christine Coe, and a range of super smart, compassionate, and thoughtful guests, you'll come away with big picture insights and practical ways to declutter your home, schedule, and mental space without getting bogged down by perfection. I have always believed that small moments and actions matter tremendously. My goal is to help you find agency and space in your life through doable baby steps that will leave you feeling accomplished instead of overwhelmed. Check out Edit Your Life wherever you enjoy your podcasts.
This is just so fascinating to me. And it's also just hearing you describe this conversation and the way you need to just show up and not say what's on your mind, or what you're thinking, but rather really go to their needs and the empathy and all that. It sounds exhausting. And how can parents support themselves when they are having to I know that they're not going to do it perfectly all the time, but how can parents restore and recharge and be able to do this in a way that works and keeps them sane?
Well, that's a big question.
Yeah.
And, I think the service that you're offering where people can listen to and communicate with each other and share their stories with each other is so valuable. I know that when my kids were little, I think I mentioned that the first group I did was through Asher's preschool. We met for 4.5 years weekly. And it really helped me to know that when I went through a period when I felt like I wanted to pull my hair out or scream at my kids, that I could go and talk to these parents who would get it and wouldn't judge me and would understand. I remember the very first time that I was just furious at Asher for something. I don't remember what it was, but I remember how furious I was. And I went to the group. We happened to have a group soon after, and we all would do a check-in. And I said, I am so furious with him. I'm ready to put him up for long-term lease. Does anybody want a 5-year-old? Mm-hmm. And they were all, I thought, oh my gosh, they're going to be shocked. They're going to be stunned. They're not going to want me to be their leader anymore. And in fact, they were all relieved to hear that I had the same feelings that they did and that I got to that point also. And it was really helpful for me to be able to vent with them instead of venting at my 5-year-old. In fact, I was going to tell you a story that's somewhat along these lines, because we all get to that point sometimes when, I would get to a point where I thought, I can't figure out what's helpful to say in this moment. I don't even care in this moment. So this happened when Asher and Rashi were somewhat older, but Asher was teasing and tormenting Rashi. He knew just what to say to get Rashi's goat, just upsetting Rashi. And I was just furious with him. And I couldn't get him to stop. And I couldn't figure out what, like cut it out was not going to work, and so I sent him to his room and calmed Rashi down. And I knew I needed to go talk to Asher to find out what was going on. But I also knew that I was in no state to do that. I really just didn't care. So I did what I knew to do when I couldn't handle a situation, which is I went to my closet, which I share with my husband. So it's got a lot of clothes in there. And so I can say things that are really horrible and mean, and the kids wouldn't hear me. And I literally went in the closet and started saying to myself, he's just horrible, horrible. How could he do this? And, how could I have given birth to such a mean kid? He's so nasty. I'm just furious at him. And then I thought, well, I guess I need to go talk to him and find out what was going on for him. But you know what? I just don't care because he's just being nasty. I had to do this for a while before I finally calmed down enough and went and talked to him. And then I was able to say, Asher, I know that you can be a really kind, sensitive kid. You have good friends and you're nice to them. There must be something that really made you mad to say those things to your brother. And that's all it took. He had a long list of complaints. Every time we go to the ball game and I want to go to batting practice, he says he wants to go. And then when it's time to leave, he lies down on the floor and he says he's too tired and we miss the whole batting practice. And then when we do our family cleanup on Sunday, we're all supposed to clean up and he doesn't help. And he says he's too tired and it's not fair. And he went on and on with this long list. I think he had compiled this list over the course of the year, and I didn't argue with him. I didn't try to explain why Rashi did what he did. I just listened, and I shouldn't say just because it wasn't easy to hear it all. But wow, no wonder you're so mad at him. He did a lot of things that you really resent. And then, and let me tell you one more. So, eventually I said to Asher, look, Rashi needs to hear it from you, but that's just too long a list for a person to be able to hear all at once. So how about we pick one thing to talk to him about? And, together we planned that he would talk to him about the cleanup, which was supposed to happen every week. And it was predictable that Rashi often would lie down the floor. This is he had sleep apnea, but this is before we knew it. So we just knew for some reason he would say he was tired. And so we went downstairs and Asher told Rashi how resentful he felt when Rashi didn't help with the cleanup. And Rashi said, he wanted to help, but sometimes he really was too tired. So then I asked the question, what can we do so the cleaner-uppers don't feel resentful? And so Rashi doesn't feel forced when he's too tired. And we came up with some chores that Rashi could do when he did have energy, because there was always garbage and recycling to take out. So Rashi, he did make sure to tell his brother when he did these chores. He wanted a way to redeem himself. So I think it made a difference. It's not that they never had a conflict again, but that level of mean teasing went away. And then when Asher got upset with Rashi, he knew there was a way to talk to him and solve the problem instead of letting it fester. Instead of getting back at him through teasing. And he knew that he had a mother who was accepting of his feelings of resentment, so he didn't have to bottle it up for so long.
Yeah. Again, there's just so many things that you just touched upon that I think are so important. Just even that giving our kid the space to talk and us listening without, responding, and just being that neutral and holding that space for our kid to just express what they need to express is really hard and takes, I think, a lot of practice.
Well, and I just want to point out the parallel because I guess you had asked me about how we take care of ourselves. And when I could, I would talk to other people who would do the same thing for me. Yeah. And in a pinch, I would use my closet, which for me worked. It wasn't, speedy, but it worked.
Yeah. No, I love that. I was thinking, is there room in my closet for me? I don't know if that's the right spot for me, but I do love that. I tend to call my sister. My sister is always happy to just hear me. Anything I have to say. So yeah, it is important to be able to get it out. Yeah. And you just talked about, that you used the word resent a number of times in that story. And, that is something that I know a lot of parents are concerned about is their neurotypical sibling growing up to resent their atypical sibling for any variety of reasons. And so, you just talked about the importance of sounds like you facilitated a conversation between them where they could kind of get to the heart of the issue, what's really going on here. Do you have any other words of advice or strategies for parents if they're noticing that one of their child is starting to resent their sibling or just the inequity that they may perceive?
Well, we touched a little bit on the frame of we don't try to give everybody equally. We try to give everybody according to their needs. And I think that's sort of an orientation or a life philosophy that I have, that I so I spoke from that place when they would say it's not fair. Instead of saying, well, it is fair because you got this and they got that, it's more like, it sounds like you really wish that you could have what your child has. In fact, I'm thinking when my kids were little, my son Rashi was also missed a lot of school. He was sick a lot. And my daughter noticed this. And, I remember her one day saying, it's not fair. I want to stay home too. How come he gets to stay home? And of course, I'm thinking in my mind, I don't want her to stay home. She's got school today. She'll be fine at school. I can't handle the two of them.
Yeah,
right. But it's, I knew that wasn't going to work. I wasn't going to be able to explain to her in a way that was going to get rid of that desire that she had to be able to stay home. So, what I said is, it sounds like you wish that you could have more special time with me too. I don't want you to miss school today. Let's think of when you and I can have special time. How about tonight when, we'll ask Daddy to put Rashi to bed so I can put you to bed and we can read some books together and we'll have some time together. And that worked for her. I was lucky. That worked for her in that moment. Mm-hmm. Again, I think that our first impulse is to try to explain to them why things are the way they are. And I think sometimes we also get triggered because we feel a little guilty. Like, why is he getting more of my attention than she is? Like, maybe that's not fair. Maybe I should, But when you have more than one child, that they have different needs at different times. There were times when she needed more attention than he did, even if he, overall probably got, if we did a mathematical formula of how much of my attention he got more than she did. But, in each moment, what I'm trying to figure out is who has what needs and whose needs am I going to meet how, and acknowledging that sometimes, my daughter felt like, I want more of your attention, and not to deny it. It's very powerful to say, it sounds like you wish you had more of my attention. So much more effective than saying, look, honey, it can't be like this. If I start by acknowledging the feelings, that gets me very far in maintaining our relationship and helping her deal with what is.
Yeah, I mean, it's so powerful when we can remember to do that, really, in any situation with our kid. And I noticed that with Asher many years ago, that the minute I just acknowledged whatever it was, it's like flipping a switch. Everything changes. Suddenly they're receptive, listening. It can shift their mood instantaneously. So that's a great reminder. One of the things that I was thinking about as you were giving that last answer is, and this goes back to something I brought up in the beginning in terms of transparency. But if you think about a family unit and, that we're all on the same team here, we're all working together. Is it good for parents to be, really talking openly about their kids' neurodifferences, and also to take it one step further, enlisting their help? Like, is it okay to say, hey, this is a really difficult situation, as for your brother or your sister. I'm wondering if you could help by doing this, this, or this. Like, is that an okay thing to do?
Well, it reminds me of when Rashi first got his diagnosis. We had all this testing done, and we were waiting for the results, and he knew exactly, what was going on. He was, I think, 12 when we finally got him diagnosed with Asperger's, and so I went into his room. I thought, I'm going to tell him in private because it's just for him to know. I took him into his room and I said, we gotten the results, and he had Asperger's. And what that means is that different people learn social thinking in different ways. Some people learn it intuitively and some people learn it concretely and explicitly. And I said, you're more the explicit learner kind, so that's good for us to know. And his very first reaction was, let's go tell Asher, which was really surprising to me. And so we went upstairs to Asher's room, and he told Asher, guess what? I have Asperger's. And I explained to Asher, at that point I hadn't really had a lot of time to digest it myself, frankly. But it was helpful to say to Asher, who had been saying to me, he just doesn't get it. He just doesn't get it. That, now we know that he learns explicitly. And so not long after that, we were home, and my daughter was playing with the neighbor girl who lives across the street named Danielle. And Danielle's mother she would typically call me when it was time to send Danielle home for dinner. And I was in the kitchen cooking, and my hands were all dirty, and the phone rang, and it was Danielle's mother. And I said, somebody pick up the phone. And Rashi said, I'll pick it up. I'll get it. And he went over and he stared at the phone, but he didn't pick it up. And we have an answering machine that picks up after 4 rings. I wanted somebody to get it before I went to the answering machine, so Danielle's mother wouldn't worry. I said, pick it up. It's Danielle's mother. And he just stared at it and didn't pick it up. And it rang for 2 rings, and it rang for 3 rings, and it was about to ring for 4 rings. And so Asher ran over and snatched the phone and answered it. And Rashi had a fit. And I remember thinking, what's going on? Like, here was Asher had rescued me because I wanted him to pick up the phone, but Rashi was furious at him. And Asher was mad at Rashi because he wasn't picking up the phone. So once we got Danielle sent home and I washed my hands, I realized that Rashi, you were doing some sort of experiment to see, if you could pick it up at the last minute before the answering machine picked up. And do you know what was going on for Asher? Do you know why he answered it? He said, no, I told him I would pick it up. I said, your words said, I'm going to pick up the phone. Your body language said, I'm not picking up the phone. And when people see a conflict between somebody's words and their body language, they always believe the body language more than the words. So that's why he picked it up. And Rashi said, this was news to him.
Yeah.
And you know what? I think it was sort of news to Asher in the sense that he wouldn't have known how to explain it to Rashi. But, I was sort of both explaining it to them, but also modeling, this is what it means when you have to learn explicitly. Rashi doesn't pick that stuff up, but once we tell him, now he knows. Now he gets it. I mean, of course, there are going to be other situations. But so in terms of talking to kids, I found it very valuable to be able to tell my kids, what does it mean to have Asperger's? What does it mean to have sleep apnea? I would explain that to them too. Not that they necessarily could know what that feels like, but before he was diagnosed, he was waking up almost once a minute to breathe. Not that he was aware of it,
Yeah.
but he was, people say, oh, I know what it feels like to be tired. I'm like, I don't know that you know what this feels like. This is beyond just like, I'm tired, I don't feel like it. And it was confusing to the others, especially when we didn't know what it was. I believed in my heart that there was something that was making him tired, that he wasn't making it up. But I didn't know, I didn't have the words for it. I didn't know what it was. But once we had the word, I found that very helpful to be able to say, he gets woken up during the night. It took a long time for the therapy to work. Now he's doing much better. But, he was exhausted. And so I had to change my expectation of what he could do. And so did the others.
Wow, that's really intense. I didn't realize that kids could suffer from sleep apnea. I can't even imagine how disruptive that would be.
I had no idea that a child that young, because what I thought was sleep apnea is something that middle-aged men get when they're overweight.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And I have learned that is not the case.
Yeah. Wow. So before we go, I would love to just ask you kind of a general question, and it just in terms of all your experience and what you've seen in your work and your workshops and any other just general best practices for handling conflict among siblings within families, getting people's needs met or understanding the underlying need sounds like it's right there at the top. But any other tips for people listening of things they could play with in their own families?
Well, I think that when we have conflict between siblings, or really conflict between any two people, our first tendency is to try to solve it so it goes away. You want that, then he wants that. Okay, just take turns, you guys. You go first, and he'll go. And we want to tell them what to do so that the conflict goes away. So one piece of advice, one thing that people can start to notice in themselves is, am I doing that? Am I trying to solve the problem before I acknowledge their feelings? Am I taking away their opportunity to learn what to do when you are in conflict with somebody else? I think that for a kid to learn the process, what do you do when somebody wants one thing and you want another? I think learning what to do is a life skill that is so valuable, and it takes a lot of practice. I mean, that's why even we as adults, we have conflicts that we don't necessarily handle well the first time. I mean, we have to learn in our marriages what to do. It's a sort of a lifelong skill that I think we first learn about in our own families. So if we can have the mindset with our kids that when there's a conflict, we're not going to just try to resolve it. We're going to try to help them learn how to resolve conflict. That little switch, that little reframe, I think can both be more effective in the moment and help us find solutions that really work for everybody, and also teach them such an important life skill that they can take with them for the rest of their lives.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think you nailed it. When there's behavior we don't like, when something's gone, we just want it to stop. Like, that's our instinct typically. Like, I want this to stop at whatever means necessary. And I think it's so important and it does take a lot of time, and patience is key, but so important to realize that, these are great learning opportunities. Conflict isn't a bad thing. It's a part of being a human. We're all going to have conflict. And this is a great practicing ground for people to learn those skills.
And let me add that you can't do this all the time. I mean, the last thing I want to do is add more guilt to people's lives.
Right.
There are going to be times when you don't have the time, you don't have the energy, you don't have the closet available to calm yourself down before you handle it, where you're going to say, I'm going to decide who uses it first and who uses it second, and somebody's not going to be happy, and we're going to talk later about what to do next time. And sometimes that's the best you can do. And just acknowledging that I'm going to decide and somebody's not going to be happy. So see, even there, I'm trying to acknowledge as best I can what's going to go on for them because I can't do the whole process.
Yeah, I imagine, especially in certain public situations or, depending on the age of your kids, parents are going to find themselves in situations where they just are in damage control mode, or they need to deal with something immediately. And the thoughtful conversation can come later. And just knowing that you do what you need to do sometimes to get through that moment, and then you can circle back. Yeah.
And I think it helped me to have thought so much about how to handle different kinds of situations, because I've worked with parents for so many years, and we have a lot of stories in the book that I think really help parents sort of think through, how would I handle this situation? And there's a little trick I can keep in the back of my mind if this ever comes up. And I love to encourage parents to share their stories. We invite people to send, if any of your listeners have stories from what they've tried after they listen to this podcast, I would love for them to send me what they've done, what they've said, how their kid responded, because I think that sharing our stories, even more than just the general principles, is what really helps us when we're in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Wow. This has been fascinating for me. And, again, not having, or having an only child, this is all completely relevant to every aspect of my life as a parent. And I know it's going to be super valuable to those listeners who have more than one kid and they're really struggling with this kind of stuff. So before we say goodbye, could you tell us the best place for listeners to connect with you and learn more about your work and your books?
Sure. We have a Facebook page for the book, How to Talk So Little Kids Will Listen. We also have a website, howtotalksolittlekidswilllisten.com. And I have a personal website, julieking.org. And you can write to me from really any one of those places, and I will respond.
Excellent. Well, listen, Julie, thank you so much for making the time and coming by and sharing this today. Again, super interesting. And I know it's going to be incredibly useful. And I really appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to the Tilt Parenting Podcast. To go deeper into this episode, visit the extensive show notes page. For every episode, there's a dedicated page on my website with links to all the resources mentioned, a full transcript, and a podcast player with key takeaways marked so you can easily go back and re-listen to the sections you're most interested in. Just go to tiltparenting.com/podcast and select this episode. The Tilt Parenting Podcast is hosted by me, Debbie Reber, author of the book Differently Wired and the founder of Tilt Parenting. This episode was edited by Andrea Curtis Amasquita, and show notes were put together by myself, Andrea, and Lindsay McFadden. If you get a lot out of this podcast and want to help cover the cost of its production, please consider joining my Patreon campaign. On Patreon, you can sign up to make a small monthly contribution, as little as $2 a month, and it's super easy to sign up. Just go to patreon.com/tiltparenting to learn more, or click on the Patreon link on any show notes page. To follow Tilt Parenting on social media, go to @tiltparenting on Instagram and Twitter and on Facebook. Lastly, please help this podcast stay visible and easily found by the listeners who need it by subscribing and leaving a rating or a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thank you so much. And that's all for this week. Stay safe, stay well, and take good care. And for more information about this podcast or any of the resources that Tilt offers, visit tiltparenting.com.
Hey, are you a parent of a teenager? Are you feeling overwhelmed about how to be what they need while also holding limits and boundaries that keep them safe? Are you tired of conversations that negate how messy this season of parenting is? Well, I've got you. My name is Casey O'Rourke. I am a positive discipline trainer, parent coach, and the host of the Joyful Courage podcast. Every week, I come to you with an interview digging into tough topics with experts I trust and solo shows that go deep into the personal growth and mindset needed to raise teens in a way that grows them into confident, capable young people. I am not afraid of getting real about the intersection of conscious parenting and the teen years, while also bringing in vulnerability, humor, and lightness. I'm walking the path with you and honored to serve. Listen to Joyful Courage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you consume podcasts.